Good morning, everyone. Good morning, country representatives and delegates. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning, and I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues for their very kind words. And I'd also like to say that I've been involved with the P166 program for the last 15 years almost, in its different guises, including the regional courses, the short courses in Geneva. We also developed an online course, so through different sorts of modalities. And this collaboration with the team, the very motivated team that runs this program, has always been very fruitful. And I think that one of the major positive aspects of the program is not that there are any teachers and students, but it's that they provide an occasion for policy dialogues. It's dialogue with policymakers, with country representatives, when we go to the countries, with people who are in the day-to-day business of doing policy, designing and implementing policy, which for us is also very precious because they have a completely different point of view than us who are doing desk research. So it's always been very much a two-way communication. And so I'd like to thank you, but also all the participants of the different activities that this very precious program has done. So now the first session of today, we are going to discuss graduation and what has been going on in the graduation process. Okay? And so the first topic that I will discuss is the evolution of the graduation process. Because as we'll see, this is something that has been undergoing transformation quite a lot ever since the beginning of the establishment of the LDC category. So, I mean, the question you might ask is, why discuss graduation? Because at the end of the day, it's not something which is relevant for all LDCs. There are several LDCs for which graduation is a distant prospect in the future. But even for them, it remains a long-term objective. And let's not forget that the objective of the very creation of the LDC category was to help these countries overcome some of their development challenges in order to accelerate their growth, their development, and so in order to help them eventually graduate out of the category. And in international policy circles, in multilateral circles, there's a lot of attention to this. There's a lot of attention, policy attention and discussions to the issue of graduation, particularly over the last, let's say, 7 to 8 years. There has been a turn towards this topic as a relevant topic. But also, because once the present wave of graduating countries comes to happen, i.e. once you have the exit of the present countries that are, as we say, in the graduation pipeline, the group of LDCs will be something quite different from what it is nowadays in terms of productive capacities, of income, of specialization, etc., etc. And this will be exactly the topic of the second session. So let's go back to when graduation started being discussed at all. Let's remember that the category of LDCs was established a long time ago. It was over 50 years ago. It was back in 1971 by a decision of the United Nations General Assembly. But it was only 20 years later, i.e. in 1991, that rules were agreed for graduation. Rules in terms of which countries should or could graduate, under what circumstances, and what would be the process for this. And it was also at that time, in the early 1990s, that the triennial review was established, which is the process by which every 3 years the category of LDCs is examined. So, and by the use of the LDC indicators, it is discussed whether there are any countries which could enter or qualify to enter the LDC category, and something which happens much more commonly, those which qualify to exit the LDC category, i.e. eventually to graduate. And this process has been happening ever since. So the last triennial review took place in New York in 2024, and the next one will take place in the beginning of 2027. And in a sense, we have already started preparing for the next triennial review. And it's not only this, and beyond this, if we fast forward another 20 years, the international community started adopting LDC graduation as an objective. And it was in the Istanbul Program of Action, which was established during the 4th International Conference on the Least Developed Countries, which of course took place in Istanbul, that for the very first time an objective was established which concerned specifically graduation. So the objective then was that half of the LDCs would meet the graduation criteria by 2020, which was the target day of the Program of Action in Istanbul. So that was LDC 4. The following LDC conference, International Conference for the Least Developed Countries, was the one which took place in Doha. That was, well, actually it took place in 2023, but the plan of action was adopted almost online, but physically in New York. But the conference took place in Doha. But in any case, the plan of action is the DPOA, the Doha Plan of Action. And there again, an objective was adopted, which was that an additional 15 LDCs meet graduation criteria by 2031. So this just shows how at the beginning it was not even mentioned, the issue of graduation, then slowly the rules for graduation were established, and then it started raising its profile in the international policy agenda. And that's where we are nowadays. So here, these are the countries which have graduated. Maybe it's not so easy to see, but I mean, just to tell you that the very first LDC that graduated was Botswana. That was in 1994. So that was just 3 years after the rules for graduation were established. And if we move forward, the very last country to graduate was São Tomé and Príncipe, which graduated 1 year ago. So it was in December 2024. But what you can notice if you look at this representation is that at the beginning there was just Botswana that graduated, and then it took another 13 years for another country to graduate, as Cabo Verde, which is here represented. And after that, there were other countries. So the point is that the fact of graduating is becoming more common. If you see, then you had Maldives, Samoa, Equatorial Guinea, Vanuatu, which very courageously graduated in 2020, even though it was the year of the pandemic. Everybody thought that the country was going to ask for a deferral, but they did not, so it did graduate right in the midst of the pandemic. Then Bhutan in 23, and last year, São Tomé and Príncipe. And if we look towards the future, it is scheduled that this graduation will continue at a certain tempo, though there are some issues which we will discuss later in this session. So it would be what is scheduled at present is next year. It's Bangladesh, Laos, People's Democratic Republic, and Nepal. then Solomon Islands in 27, and in 29, Cambodia and Senegal. So again, showing that it's not just a matter of policy attention, that the fact is happening, and in the foreseeable future, chances are that it will continue. So it's 6 countries that are scheduled to graduate until the end of the decade. So now I'll turn to LDC's attitudes towards graduation, because we have seen that it has started drawing policy attention. Some consensus has been built around the importance of graduation on the side of the international community, international organizations. But then the question is, what do LDCs think about graduation? Are they eager to graduate? Are they reluctant to graduate? And the simple answer is there is no simple answer to this. Everything depends on the country and at the point of time in which it is considering the issue. I think that we have here Cabo Verde, which is a country which has already gone through the process many years ago, and I was told that a couple of years after this, it started having second thoughts on the process of graduation. But this shows that circumstances change, and therefore attitudes towards graduation change a long time. So, I mean, and quite often countries have, so to say, mixed feelings vis-à-vis graduation. So, in a sense, there is a feeling of pride. Why a feeling of pride? Well, quite simply, because those countries which qualify for graduation, this is done on the basis of very objective criteria, economic criteria, social criteria, environmental criteria, etc. And they are only recommended for graduation because they have undergone a certain phase of their development process, because they have grown, because they have reduced their vulnerability, because they have improved their health situation, their education situation, etc. So this is the basis for being recommended for graduation. So, and it's right that countries become proud when they start when they are recommended for graduation, or as we say, when they pre-qualified for for graduation for the first time. And there was a very obvious case, which was back in 21, when one of the countries that pre-qualified was Bangladesh, and that coincided with 50 years of independence. So it was very much, there was a big political splurge, if I may say, about it, because it was 50 years of independence of the country, and it was exactly the same year in which the country was pre-qualified, was declared as pre-qualified for graduation out of the LDC category. And it's not just the case of Bangladesh, it's generally the case of most countries. But at the same time, there is some sort of uneasiness, disquiet about what are the consequences of graduation. Because even while being an LDC, it is quite common that policymakers are not fully aware of all of the privileges, if I could say, of the special treatments that the country gets by being an LDC. Because everyone knows about trade, but there are benefits in the domain of finance, in the domain of technology, of technical assistance, etc. And even if countries are aware, doesn't mean that they take advantage of these. They are called international support measures, that they are presenting projects for financing by the enhanced international framework, that they are applying for finance through the LDC fund, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden they say, oh my God, we are going to lose access. So what is coming next? So first of all, there is quite, the first reaction is of surprise. what are we going to lose? And there's quite often confusion, because quite often countries, when they reach this stage, they are not low-income countries any longer. They are typically lower middle-income countries in the classification of the World Bank, except that these are two utterly independent processes, the classification vis-à-vis the United Nations and vis-à-vis the World Bank. So one of the first tasks that we have as United Nations system is to clarify what are the consequences of graduation. And then a second question that comes, okay, let's say we have understood what we are going to lose. We are going to lose access to the tech bank, to everything but arms in the European Union, to technical assistance from the EIF, the Enhanced Integrated Framework. But does it mean that after we graduate, are we out there in the cold? Do we lose every form of preferential treatment? And again, this is not right, because there are forms of SDT, of special and differential treatment, which applies to more or less all developing countries, even if they are not LDCs. So, I mean, most of the agreements of the WTO have some form of special and differential treatment for developing countries, even though they are far less favorable than LDC treatment. But also in terms of trade, you have the GSP, the General System of Preferences, you have the GSP Plus, which is a special form, more favorable form of preferential treatment in different markets in the European Union, but also in other markets. Except that, contrary to the case of LDC treatment, it is not automatic. Countries have to negotiate. There are conditionalities, particularly in terms of social rights, human rights, political rights, etc. So it is not as straightforward as LDC treatment is. But at the same time, doesn't mean that all preferential treatment is lost once the countries lose their LDC status. So all of this is part of the training, capacity building, policy dialogue that the United Nations system does with all the countries, starting from the time when they pre-qualify for graduation. So it's UNCTAD, but also our colleagues from New York, from DESA, from OHR, LLS, etc. So now we are in a situation in which the issue of graduation has become even more complex than what it used to be. Why? Well, it's because the international environment has become even more challenging than what it used to be. And so, I mean, first of all, we are undergoing a sharp decline in official development assistance. And the figures show this. It's clear, it's very clear. In 2024, there was already a quite significant decline in official development assistance. And the projections shows that in 2025, there will be an additional cut in official development assistance. And this is true for all developing countries, but it's also true for for LDCs. And why is this particularly a problem for LDCs? Well, quite simply because of the fact that LDCs are much more dependent on official development assistance as a form of the external financing for development than other developing countries. Which means that all countries are receiving less official development assistance, but for LDCs it's much more of a challenge than for other recipients of ODA. And this means that the conditions of taking their development process forward are much more challenging today than they were even 2 years ago, without going back to the commodities boom or anything like this. But As you all know, there are rising trade tensions. You have the tariffs which are being imposed, and UNCTAD studies have shown that the tariffs which have been imposed, particularly by developed countries, they are hitting LDCs much more than they are hitting developed countries. So, I mean, LDCs are taking a hit on the front of development finance. They are taking a hit on the front of international trade. Okay? But still, in the field of international trade, and concerning graduation, the LDC group in the WTO has been very active trying to modify the SDT, the special and differential treatment provisions of the different WTO agreements, because as you know, you have important SDT provisions in the WTO in agreements like the TRIPS agreement, agreement on subsidies, the agreement on agriculture, etc. So the LDC group in Geneva has been very active trying to negotiate extension of these benefits of these SDT, special and differential treatment measures beyond graduation. And this has proved to be a very difficult, very tough negotiations. It has been going for several years. There was already some elements which were agreed in the last ministerial conference, which was MC13. But since some elements were agreed, they were far, far from what the LDCs were asking for. And then there was some sort of discussion forums which were established. And so there is an intention of taking new decisions and possibly more favorable decisions in MC14, which will happen next year I think it's in Côte d'Ivoire in April. Cameroon, sorry, Cameroon in April next year. Okay? And as we know, we are living a context in which the world economy is being hit one way or the other by growing geopolitical alignment, tensions, etc., in which, of course, none of this is initiated by the LDCs. But as we said, as UNCTAD said, when the trade tensions and trade wars started, there's an African saying that when elephants fights, is the grass that bears the brunt of the fight. So this is exactly what is happening again right now. You have the big players in international trade waging wage war at each other, but of course the ones which are most hardly hit are the ones who, again, which are most vulnerable to developments in the international field, which are the LDCs. So, in this context, there is rising apprehension about graduation again. Okay? So this, again, adds an element or a layer of complexity to the issue and to the discussions about graduation. So now let's say what have been, I said that there are mixed feelings vis-à-vis graduation. There is pride, but there's disquiet, there is discomfort, there is uncertainty. So in order to respond to this, the international community over the years has taken different policy initiatives in order to help, in order to accompany LDCs in the process of graduation. Remember, we are not going to go into details, but it is a long process. Between the time in which a country pre-qualifies for graduation and the time in which it graduates, it can easily take 8 years, and even the final loss of LDC treatment can happen even earlier, so it would mean 11 years after pre-graduation. So we are talking about a process which extends over time, but exactly for this reason, it's better that countries start preparing for graduation as soon as possible. So first of all, there have been transition periods, meaning that typically in the field of international trade, once countries graduate, they do not lose immediately the LDC treatment in the field of international trade. So several markets which accord this special and differential treatment, they have given longer periods for countries to keep these special treatment, even though they have already graduated. And typically, many institutions have extended this ongoing LDC treatment for 3 years. So, for instance, the European Union, the differential treatment for LDCs is called EBA. It stands for everything but arms. And this EBA treatments, which basically means it's very favorable, it means that LDCs can export to the European market anything except for arms, but otherwise all products free of quota and contingents and free of tariffs, of course. It's duty-free, quota-free treatment, okay? And this treatment goes on 3 years after graduation. And also international mechanisms like the EIF, that's the Enhanced Integrated Framework, which is managed not far from here. It's down the hill. It's hosted in the WTO. So countries which graduate, LDCs that graduate, they can continue for 3 years to apply to EIF projects and to benefit from the technical assistance projects which are managed by the EIF. And by the same token, you have the same treatment by another element of the UN community, which is the Tech Bank, the United Nations Technology for the LDCs. Again, 3 years after countries graduate, they can still benefit from LDC treatment, whether it's in terms of technology needs, assessment, whether it's in terms of patent pooling, etc., the different types of technical assistance that the Tech Bank gives to LDCs. The downside is that not all countries, particularly the bilateral donors of preferences, have these transition periods. So it's in the case of Japan, China, etc., there is not this transition period. So once the countries lose the LDC status, they do not continue enjoying LDC treatment in these other important markets, which means that's why I was saying that it's important for these countries to start preparing ahead of time to see what the type of trade agreements they can negotiate with these important markets once they lose LDC treatment. And this is true even for important markets, because even the European Union, there is a longer transition period, but eventually this transition period does come to an end. So other mechanisms that the international community has put in place in order to accompany LDCs in their process of graduation. First of all, there is iGrad. This is an initiative of technical assistance, which has been put in place to the benefit of graduating countries. So it's an offer of services in the field of finance, in the field of trade, in other fields of technical assistance, etc., which countries can request. And it's it's a program that has been in the making for several years, and now it is up and running. It was prepared for several years, and it is already operational. And its mandate was confirmed by the Doha Program of Action, and it's got funding. So it is something that graduating countries should avail themselves of, because there are all sorts of different types of technical assistance, whether it's for trade negotiations, whether it's for the preparation of technical assistance project requests, whether it's for the preparation of financing requests in the field of climate finance, of development finance, etc. There are different streams of work of this facility which are already set up to provide technical assistance to graduating LDCs. Another element of backing and support to LDCs is that the United Nations has set up these enhanced monitoring mechanisms, which means that ever since a country pre-qualifies for graduation, there is a follow-up with the United Nations Secretariat. This is run by our colleagues in DESA, the CDP Secretariat. And so there is a follow-up of the macroeconomic, but also the social situation, but also environmental situation of countries, which are in the pipeline for graduation, which go much beyond the LDC criteria. It's a whole series of indicators which are collected and analyzed, and either once a year or twice a year there's a meeting of the Secretariat, but also of other agencies. So UNCTAD also participates in these policy dialogues with the countries which are in the pipeline for graduation. And the objective for this is to try to avoid the bad surprises in the future, like they have happened in the past, and I'll come back to that. Another is the transition phase between when the CDP, that's the Committee for Development Policy, makes the recommendation for graduation and the actual date of graduation. Traditionally, there used to be a so-called grace period, which used to be of 3 years. And now, in more recent cases, it's typically been extended to 5 years. This was first the case in 2021, which was just in the aftermath of the pandemic, but still the effects are being felt very seriously. So the grace period which started being recommended was of 5 years rather than 3 years. But still, and beyond these mechanisms which have already been established, there are ongoing discussions between LDCs, between their development partners in different forums, in the LDC conferences, but also in other forums, on the establishment of other graduation support measures, okay, beyond these. But these are still under discussion. So the whole idea of this is to accompany countries throughout this process, to help them undergo, and particularly to help them plan for what will follow graduation. Because, of course, once a country graduates doesn't mean that it is a developed country. It is still a developing country. Of course, it's not in the lower ranks among developing countries, but since the development process goes on, the idea is to better prepare the countries for their life, for their economic life, for their development process after losing the benefits of being an LDC, so that there is no disruption or no major disruption in their development process once they lose these preferential treatment measures. So, and now let me turn to graduation deferral. What is typically graduation deferral? Well, typically graduation deferral refers to a country which has already been recommended for graduation. Remember, the recommendation is done by the Committee for Development Policy. Then it is examined by the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the General Assembly, and eventually it is approved by the General Assembly. Okay? But there have been some cases in which either a decision was not taken or in which a decision was taken, but it was reversed. And as we will see, there has been more than one case. So Tuvalu, it was first recommended for graduation back in 2012, but to this very date, the GA, the General Assembly, has refused to take a decision on the graduation of Tuvalu. So, I mean, the decision on the graduation has been deferred several times. So last time it was deferred, it was in 2024. So now it's up to be taken up in the agenda of the GA in 2027. Similarly, for Kiribati, if we stay in the same region, it was recommended for graduation in 2018, but the GA, the General Assembly, has refused to take a decision on its case. The last time it deferred the decision again, it was in 2024, so the case will be discussed again in 2027. Then we have the case of Djibouti. We have a representative of Djibouti here. It was recommended by the CDP in 2024. Remember, that was the last triennial review of the LDC category. But when it came to ECOSOC and the GA, they refused again to take a decision, and so the case will be examined again in 2027. Then there is the case of the Solomon Islands. It was scheduled to graduate in 2022, but then it suffered a typhoon, etc. And it had already gone through the General Assembly. It suffered a very serious typhoon, so it made a request for the deferral of graduation, which was granted by the General Assembly, and so it's now scheduled to graduate in 2027, which means 5 years after its initial foreseen scheduled date of graduation. But also, you had the case of Angola, which was even more convoluted, because it was first recommended, no, it was recommended to graduate, and it did all its way through the CDP, ECOSOC, the General Assembly. It was scheduled to graduate in 2021. But then oil prices started falling, and the country experienced economic difficulties, and so it asked for a deferral. And it did get, so it was scheduled to graduate, I guess it was in March or April 2024. But then the oil prices declined much further, so the country experienced even more serious economic difficulties, and so it negotiated very strongly with the development partners at the General Assembly. So in December 2023, so just a couple of months before the date in which it was supposed to graduate, it managed to get a deferral. It's a deferral without any definite date. And it so happened that in the last triennial review of the LDC category 2024, Angola does not even qualify for graduation any longer. And it's because of cases like this and others that enhanced monitoring mechanism was going to set up, so that if you have a closer follow-up of the economic and social conditions of the country, and there is a marked deterioration in the economic performance of the country, then there is policy action concerning graduation which is taken before going through the whole process of CDP recommendation, ECOSOC taking notice of the recommendation, and finally the GA taking note of the recommendation. And in this sense, the very last possible example that we have is again the case that I mentioned earlier, which is the case of Bangladesh, which again was recommended for graduation in 2021. It was given a grace period of 5 years, which means that it's scheduled for graduation in 2026. But now that the deadline is approaching, there is increased uneasiness, particularly within the economic milieu, among the investors, the entrepreneur sector of the country, which is very much dependent on trade preferences for their exports, particularly in the garment sector, but also to an extent another very important industry which the country has developed thanks to the preferential LDC treatment, which is the pharmaceutical industry. So there are more and more discussions between politicians, between business people, but also between academics. And so much so that they have made a request to the UN Secretariat, and the UN Secretariat is at this very moment doing an evaluation of the country's readiness for graduation, which is again another, and mind you, Bangladesh is one of the most successful LDCs. So this just shows how the market deterioration in the international environment can cause an upheaval in the graduation process. So what we have seen through all of these different examples is that there are different justifications why countries ask for graduation. Can be because there was a typhoon, because they are going to lose preferences on which they are so much dependent and on which they have based their development process to a big extent. It can be political upheaval. It can be a fall in commodity markets. So in each case, it's different. But also, there is no common procedure. In some cases, countries ask for deferral to the CDP. In some other cases, they ask for a deferral to the General Assembly. In some other cases, they ask to ECOSOC. So there is no common procedure for this. But also no common deadlines. Supposing that a deferral is granted, will it be for 2 years, for 3 years, for 5 years? There are no common rules for this. So decisions are very much taken on an ad hoc basis. And because of this, there are no clear criteria for when to grant a deferral, when not to grant a deferral. Because you have to think that each time a country asks for a deferral, it's never granted automatically. There are always countries which think that it should be granted, countries which think it should not be granted. Okay, no matter whether they are developed or developing countries, there are different opinions for all sorts of reasons, and there are very heated decisions and discussions rather on this. And so what is the consequence of all this, the fact that you have different cases in different situations in which this has taken place for different reasons, with different justifications, etc., etc. And even though there have been several favorable decisions, there is no clarity on the process. And what is the risk? The risk is that this could put in jeopardy the very credibility of the graduation process, which has been very painstakingly been set up throughout many years with the criteria, the procedures, etc., the preparatory work that we in UNCTAD do, that our colleagues in New York do, etc., etc. So if decisions are taken on an ad hoc basis, this puts into question the credibility of the system. And so exactly because of this, there has been an initiative which is the adoption of an omnibus bill. An omnibus, Freudian slip, an omnibus resolution in New York, okay, which would be a resolution to be taken by the GA, by the General Assembly, which will put rules to all of this, under which circumstances countries can ask for a deferral. What would be the procedure? Should it go through the CDP? Should it go directly to ECOSOC or directly to the General Assembly? Should there be technical reports which should be written, just like we write technical reports before the graduation process? What should be the grace period between the recommendation for graduation and the actual graduation? That's why it's called an omnibus bill, because there are earlier resolutions, but they are before everything that has been happening, because before all of these processes that I was talking about. And in sort of preparation for this, 2 weeks ago, there was this year's resolution on LDCs, because as you probably know, every year there is a resolution on LDCs, which is taken by the General Assembly. And this resolution, it foresees the creation of a forum comprising both LDCs and LDC development partners. It's an informal thing, but the objective of which is exactly to take substantive and policy discussions in preparation for writing this so-called omnibus resolution. Okay. So this, the objective would to bring clarity to the process, to bring clarity also for economic agents, for governments and policymakers. And now I'd like just to finish by recalling what are some of the elements of UNCTAD's work in support of graduation process. So first of all, we are responsible for preparing the vulnerability profile, which means that each time a country pre-qualifies for graduation, the General Assembly has mandated UNCTAD to prepare a vulnerability profile. And what is the vulnerability profile? Well, as the name indicates, is to identify points in which the country is vulnerable, but vulnerable in several senses. It can be economically vulnerable, socially vulnerable, environmentally vulnerable, even politically vulnerable. And because there's always these processes that these vulnerabilities will come back with a vengeance in the future and could derail the path towards graduation. So that's why we undertake this very in-depth study. It's a very detailed study, which is it's based on the 5 P's of the SDG. So this is people, planet, prosperity. What are the other ones? Anyway, yeah? Peace, yeah, exactly. So, which means that we are undertaking a multidimensional analysis of these countries and trying to identify vulnerabilities in all of these economic, social, environmental, political, etc. Dimensions, okay? And there we also try to identify what are the possible consequences of these vulnerabilities, and therefore what would be remedial policy actions which national governments could take, possibly with the backing of their development partners, in order to reduce or to attenuate these vulnerabilities in the preparatory process for graduation, which once again is something which takes several years. Okay, so these are some of the vulnerability profiles that we have already undertaken, and right now we are we have started the process of preparing these vulnerability profiles for the countries which were pre-qualified in 2024, and these were Uganda, United Republic of Tanzania, and Rwanda. And so what are the purposes of these vulnerability profiles? First of all, they are supposed to serve as a background analytical information for the CDP, the Committee for Development Policy, because this is the starting point of the process of graduation. It's the CDP that decides to recommend or not to recommend a country for graduation. But perhaps as important as this is the policy discussions with which we as UNCTAD Secretariat undergo with national policymakers, but not just national policymakers, but also other economic agents like the private sector, civil society, but also the country's development partners. So very much upstream in the process, we are already having this process of policy dialogues. And as a consequence of this, of the acquaintance and of the in-depth knowledge that we get of these economies, we are able to provide also suggestions and orientations for the preparation of medium-term policies and programs. So how do we go about it? Once a country pre-qualifies, we go on an inception mission in which we get acquainted with the main relevant stakeholders, again, in terms of policymakers, but also civil society, also the private sector and development partners. And so we establish contacts and we start policy dialogue. On this basis, we draft the vulnerability profile, and we do a national validation workshop, which is something very broad. We invite all representatives of all of these different stakeholders, of course, policymakers, but other people who will eventually be affected by graduation. So the enterprise sector, the civil society, etc. And we present our conclusions, our suggestions, and then we establish dialogue among them. We discuss these suggestions, etc. We do group work on some specific issues and critical questions that we have identified in our work, so that we arrive at a process of co-creation. Then we submit these reports to the CDP, and the CDP takes its decision, and eventually we publish these reports, which have been validated by the national stakeholders, the stakeholders of these countries' development. But also, because we have gone into such a serious policy dialogue, because we have established links and networks with the stakeholders, because we have accumulated knowledge, we try to continue in this process. And so if there is a request from countries, we also collaborate with them in the preparation of the smooth transition strategy, which is a strategy that these countries prepare once their graduation has been confirmed in preparation for their graduation. So the issue looking forward, we have already seen what has been the cases of graduation which have taken place until now, what are the foreseeable cases for graduation, though even that, as we saw, even there it's not so serious. But the fact of the matter is that once the present wave of graduation takes place, which will happen sooner or later, this will change the composition of the LDC group quite significantly. Why? Because as we'll see now, the group of countries which are in the pipeline for graduation and those which are not in the pipeline for graduation, they have quite some different characteristics. And so therefore, this is what is going to be discussed now in the second session of this short course. And thank you for your attention.